Well, ladies and gentlemen, shall we make a start? I think there are a few people still joining, so we'll make a slow start. A very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today in the second of the FFI webinar series. We are going to have a series of speakers who I'll be introducing shortly. We'll then have Q&A after the speakers have all presented. And at the bottom of your screen, I'm sure everybody's familiar with Zoom already, but just in case there's anybody who hasn't yet experienced the delights of Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Do load in your questions there, and we'll pick them up. If we fail to get through everything in the time, I'm sure we can follow up afterwards because we'll have a record of everything here. So the theme here is what we're looking at in 2020, which was going to be a banner year for environment and conservation. It was going to be a huge year in terms of global events, focusing on climate, focusing on nature, and a great opportunity for nations and all sorts of parties to come together to talk about climate, COP26, to talk about nature and so on. And of course, none of that's now happening this year. And while many of us in lockdown have been reading people enthusing about how lovely it is that they can hear the bird song and how carbon levels have fallen, the reality, of course, is that many of those huge problems have not gone away. The threats remain very, very great. And indeed, in lockdown, some of the threats to nature are potentially worse. Some of the ways in which people have been able to support conservation have been undermined. And of course, with economies in a terrible state and people's livelihoods massively endangered, some of the threats to nature from the harvesting of wildlife have intensified. But today, what we want to think about is how potentially the UK could lead in looking forward at some of these great problems and how we tackle them. The UK undoubtedly has an opportunity to play a leading role and has shown really encouraging signs of that in the past couple of years. So we're going to hear about that opportunity, what we should and could expect from a policy point of view, and what role the UK might play, and also the role that FFI might play and can play looking forward. That's enough from me. Let me start by introducing our first speaker, Tony Juniper, who will be very well known to many of you. Tony is a seasoned campaigner, writer. He is chair of Natural England, and over 30 years, more than 30 years, he has campaigned for greater sustainability in society and the merits of nature. He's been a trustee of FFI, so we know him well, and he's been a great contributor in many of our debates in the past. I particularly enjoyed one particular thing I found on a website, which was Tony described by The Independent, by popular consent, the most effective of Britain's eco-warriors. Tony, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. It's a great pleasure to be here to share a few thoughts this afternoon, including from the perspective of my new role as the chairman of a government agency, where obviously we are seeking to support the UK government in its activities on some of these questions we're talking about today. And I guess, you know, from the perspective of long service on the environmental side, I think some remarkable things happened over the last couple of years. The rise of the profile of the climate question, it was there for a long time, but over the last 2 years, it suddenly rocketed upwards and then was joined by the nature crisis. And the two things not only have individually achieved incredible profile over the recent past, and as a result of a combination of scientific reports and then also campaigning work by the likes of Extinction Rebellion and others, not only have these two things risen up, but they've become increasingly connected in people's minds, with the idea of there being complementary action to cut carbon and recover nature now becoming a pretty mainstream idea. And of course, that was feeding in to some of the ambition that many people had for 2020 of a real uplift in global action through this 2020 super year, with hoped for breakthrough agreements in the climate change treaty and also the biodiversity treaty. Of course, we've been temporarily delayed in those summits because of the COVID-19 question, but nonetheless, the level of global profile and the rapidity of that, it was really remarkable. And the level of consensus now, in many countries at least, is remarkable too. But I think, you know, all of my experience tells me that when you look at the global picture and ambition in those kinds of treaty processes, it is always the case that those summits only ever make progress when there is appetite inside the member nations that are negotiating those summits. And so this is not only a top-down process where countries agree there's a massive problem and something must be done, but it's also a willingness that's coming from the bottom up. And I guess one of the places where I saw that most vividly was at Paris in 2015, when the climate change treaty reached that new mark of the Paris Agreement. And what happened there, it was a change of approach, because previously for 25 years, countries had tried to agree a package where everybody's targets were agreed by everybody else. And this was a moment when nations took responsibility and said, we're going to deliver X to achieve the global goal, and it's going to be under our control, and we're going to go ahead by showing leadership. And the breakthrough there was in some part achieved by the fact that the UK had already agreed its Climate Change Act. We'd already taken action at home through a domestic legal instrument that set a path in law for several decades. And other countries looked at that and said, actually, this isn't a complete disaster, because if they're still growing and their economy is competitive, if their public back this and at the same time they're cutting emissions, maybe we could do that too. And so it did create confidence and it created trust. And I think on the biodiversity and the nature side, we're behind the climate curve in terms of being able to build that global momentum. But I do think that on that subject too, the rubber will hit the road most firmly inside individual countries. And that's where I think the UK right now really has an opportunity to show some leadership. And there's quite a few pieces we have in play at the moment that could do that. And so one is the 25-year environment plan, which was launched by the Prime Minister in 2018. And there is some really good stuff in there. And, you know, the headline of it actually is really quite an important headline, because that is one of the few government policies that I've seen which says that, you know, the whole old history of conservation about protecting the last fragments of habitat and trying to hang on to the last rare populations of endangered species. We've gone beyond that to say the agenda isn't only about that any longer. It's now about recovery and leaving nature in a better state than we found it. And that is a big change. And so within that, there are ambitions around a nature recovery network and putting back habitat on a large scale and doing it in a way that reflects the ambition of the Lawton Review 10 years ago, which is more, bigger, better, and crucially connected natural habitats, and to be restoring and reintroducing lost species. And so that work is underway, and at Natural England, we're really getting our teeth into that now. And that is being backed in turn by action in what is the most significant sector for conservation, namely agriculture. And we're going to have a new post-Common Agricultural Policy agricultural scheme here, so-called public money for public goods through this new environmental land management scheme. It's still being designed, but through that we could have significant investment to the tune of billions of pounds into the recovery of landscape level populations of declining species, and also landscapes restored. And some of that work is beginning to come together, and it could be backing rewilding as part of that. We have a policy to restore, or actually to create 30,000 hectares of woodland every year. That's 300 square kilometers in a country the size of this one that is significant. It's about the area of Birmingham. To be doing that every year, we could be targeting that into the river valleys to not only catch carbon, but to restore the quality of rivers, to be reducing flood risk, and of course restoring lost and endangered animal populations, if that joined up approach can be put together. And we also have this idea of development having to deliver net biodiversity gain, which is another tool that we have in the box. And so if you start putting all of that together, you could see actually that this country could be turning the corner over the next half decade to a decade, and that would be of enormous value on the global stage, because I think we've become used to this idea that the loss of nature is the price of progress and it's a natural partner. No, it isn't. And if we can show that you can improve the well-being of the people, you can grow your economy, you can drive new technologies, you can be a global leader in lots of different sectors, industrial sectors, at the same time as rebuilding your nature, that's going to prove the opposite to what is already assumed. And if you add to that management of our global footprint, which is another element of the 25-year plan through this global resource initiative, and being able to look at what we're importing and to reduce the footprint of that, then I think we are set for this country to genuinely be a world leader. And I sincerely hope that that will be the case. And at the moment, of course, you know, we're coming through this terrible crisis that the country's been in. And one of the things that is important about that is how some people are pointing to the fact that the pandemic is itself an environmental issue. And if we do want to defend ourselves from future pandemics, action on the wildlife trade, action on deforestation, action to reduce the risks created by industrial farming are part of what we need to do for recovery, which aligns exactly with us being able to present that domestic leadership as not only good for nature, but also good for reducing future risk. So I think the pieces and, you know, the stars are quite well aligned here at the moment. And so the more that we can link what we can do at home with the global picture, the more we can derive both ends, I would say. Over. You have to press your
Tony, thank you very much.
Yeah.
That was great. And it's so heartwarming to hear that very, very positive message when I think a lot of us are filled with gloom about what can be done. And to hear from you with the perspective of your position as chair of Natural England of how the UK can give a leadership role. And there's always a sense in many of the international negotiations that the developed world is lecturing developing countries on what to do, having done a lot of things ourselves in our history. So to hear you speak about what the objectives are within Natural England and indeed how we thought about climate in the past is great. Let us move on to our second speaker, and a very warm welcome to Dilys Roe. Dilys is the lead for conservation and biodiversity for the International Institute for Environment and Development. And she has a particular focus on the human dimensions of conservation, including the understanding and supporting the conditions required for effective community-based conservation. And I think so much of what we talk about in FFI and Tony too in Natural England is about how you make this work for people. It's not about putting fences around natural spaces. And this is about the future of humanity within and in harmony with the natural world. So Dilys, thank you so much for joining us. And we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And I'm hoping that there might be some slides miraculously appearing on the screen in front of us, if Laura's able to do that. Great. Great. So I'm going to move a little bit more to the global stage and talk about what we had hoped would have been UK leadership in the 2020 super year, but now will hopefully be the 2021 super year for biodiversity. And I'm speaking about this not as any employee of government, but as a member of an organisation which actively engages along with FFI and other civil society organisations, with UK government in sort of trying to push them into this leadership position and to the making demands of the global community that we would like to see. So next slide, please. I'm just going to step back a little bit to set the context for my talk to what seems like an absolute eternity ago, but was actually almost exactly a year ago, July 2019, where we, IIED, along with FFI, WCS, and a number of other organizations, partnered with a communications group to form the People and Nature campaign, which was essentially a campaign targeted at UK parliamentarians to get them to take nature more seriously in the same way that they've been taking climate change seriously. And this campaign arose out of an earlier push led by Zach Goldsmith to allocate more of the UK's aid budget to nature conservation. The initial call for that didn't succeed. There was a lot of pushback against that because the aid budget is about delivering on poverty reduction objectives. And it was a struggle to see how just investing in nature and setting aside, I think the ask was $1 billion for nature would really deliver on poverty reduction. So there was a bit of a rethink of the campaign, which entailed the bringing into the campaign of organisations like IIED and FFI, CAFOD, Oxfam and others. And we rebranded it as the People and Nature campaign. Major uplift of its flagship conservation initiative, the Darwin Initiative. It announced an uplift of its Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund, and it announced a new fund for nature conservation called the Biodiverse Landscapes Fund. So this was great from a nature conservation point of view, a sort of real sea change in the kinds of things that we had been seeing beforehand. And then to cap it all, the UK was confirmed as the host of Climate COP26, again due to be held in 2020, with a very strong focus on nature as part of their pitch for hosting the COP. So this all seemed incredibly positive up through the spring of this year until COVID-19 hit us in March. And all of a sudden, it was clear that these big events were not going to happen in 2020. Essentially, the super year was put on hold. All of the major negotiations were postponed, eventually moved to 2021. And not just were these major events postponed, but within the UK aid system, there's been a total review of where funding has been allocated, and it's had to be reprioritized to address COVID concerns. And the overall aid budget has declined because GDP has gone down dramatically, and the aid budget is currently determined by GDP. It's 0.7% of GDP. So as our economy goes down, so the aid budget goes down. So this is potentially disastrous, and lots of concern about this, the impact of COVID. Has it totally scuppered not just 2020 as a super year for nature, but this global attention to nature, and particularly this UK leadership on nature? And I think it could have been a turning point in either direction. As it was, again, Zach Goldsmith, who has been a real champion for our cause, and has, as I said, with the People and Nature campaign, has moved from just focusing on nature to recognizing that we need to link nature to the well-being of people, and also recognizing that we need to link nature and climate outcomes. He sort of put out a tweet reasonably early on in the outbreak of COVID saying, this represents a major turning point for society, and this is a time where we really need to reset our relationship with nature, and suggested that just as after World War II, we really needed to have a rethink about our political relationships, the formation of the UN, etc. So following COVID-19, we needed to rethink our relationship with nature. And he suggested that we needed to formulate some kind of covenant with nature. One of the early things that we did in response to this, again, under the umbrella of the People and Nature campaign, was to say, yes, you know, we agree with you, we do need to reset our relationship with nature, but it needs to be a covenant for nature and people, not just a covenant for nature. So we put together a paper on this as part of our role as the steering committee of the People and Nature campaign, setting out what we thought, how the UK government could frame this covenant, what it might look like, and the kinds of things that could be included in it. And what we suggested was that this would be something that the UK government would use to show its leadership in putting its own house in order, but also then encouraging other governments to also then commit to similar kinds of principles. And it has three sort of key overarching principles within it. This is what we're suggesting from the People and Nature campaign. The first, that the health of both people and nature should be at the heart of economic recovery following the COVID pandemic, and recognizing, as Tony said, you know, that the outbreak of the pandemic really does have its foundations in nature and the way we treated nature. The second ask is that all private investments, corporate operations, trade agreements, and so on and so forth, that we should make sure that these do not threaten the well-being of either people or nature. And then the final ask, similar to the one that was in the People and Nature campaign launched last year, but moving beyond just securing an ambitious agreement in the CBD, was really scaling up ambition internationally to deliver solutions across all of the global agreements that are due to take place this year and next year. So this includes the UN General Assembly, which is coming up in September this year with a summit on biodiversity, the Climate Change Convention, the CBD, the Convention to Combat Desertification, the G20, the G7, the High Seas negotiations, everything. All of these things are connected and need to be addressed in an integrated way. And in terms of things where we would really like to see the UK government taking leadership and potentially then having parallel commitments from other governments, are around a green recovery plan for the UK, but also putting nature in decision making, not just at home, but also overseas. So seeing it reflected in our aid budget, in our trade agreements, and so on. In terms of ensuring private investments, etc., do not threaten the well-being of people and nature, a strong environment bill, which actually includes measures to tackle our UK footprint. So again, sort of great progress has been made on this, and recognition that there's no point in sort of having biodiversity safeguards and so on in place in things like our aid agreements if we don't tackle our own footprint overseas. Sustainable supply chains, looking at coming to agreements with producer countries of key commodities as to how to green those supply chains. And thinking about environmental and social impact disclosures for companies that want to be listed on the London Stock Exchange. And finally, in terms of sort of scaling up ambition, the things that we really think that the UK could take a leadership on are, particularly with its hosting of COP26, the Climate Change Convention, really championing this alignment between the CBD and the Climate Change Convention, really championing nature-based solutions in both of those conventions, and with the on the oceans side, championing a 30% oceans protection by 2030 commitment. We don't know how this will fall with UK government, and as I understand it, the covenant is now sort of moving into a higher level of operation, and potentially might be something that comes out at the UN General Assembly. But this is the kind of key content that we would like to see in it, and where we really think that the UK could demonstrate leadership both at home and overseas. So we are seeing positive signs going forward. The COP26 has now moved to November 2021, and there's still maintaining a really strong focus on nature in the run-up to the COP. So the Nature Campaign, that's part of the COP preparations, led by UK government, includes 4 key areas of focus. One on sustainable land use and commodities trades, that is tackling these things about footprints, sustainable supply chains. One on financing nature-based solutions, coming up with green investment packages that can secure a green recovery. A focus on just rural transitions. How do you support people that have been dependent on energy, on fossil fuels and so on, to move into alternative energy sources and alternative ways of making a living in a way that is just? We don't want our ambitions to show more leadership on climate change and nature to have a negative impact on people's livelihoods. And finally, on oceans, really championing the this oceans commitment, 30 by 30, leading the Oceans Alliance. And I think the government just recently announced a big new fund for oceans related work. In terms of the run-up to the UN General Assembly, as I said, there's going to be a biodiversity summit on the 30th of September at the end of the General Assembly, and the UK is really playing a part in sort of trying to shape that. And you know, we would really like to see the UK taking a leadership role and really driving some announcements of commitments at that General Assembly that other countries will also sign up to. And finally, next year, the UK government is not only the president of the COP26, but is also taking over the G7 presidency. So again, we've had discussions with various bits of government thinking about what could they really champion as part of their G7 presidency. Biodiversity has come up in other G7 meetings, notably in the French presidency, but also in the Canadian presidency. They like the idea of having sort of follow through commitments. So we think there's real potential there for the UK to continue to show leadership on pushing a strong nature agenda through 2021, through its presidency of the G7 and into the COP26 and beyond. Some key challenges though, which I think really shouldn't be underestimated. The first, in terms of the CBD and trying to get that alignment between CBD and climate change COP, is the obvious sort of diplomatic tensions currently occurring between the UK and China, between America and China, etc. So, you know, there will be diplomatic challenges to overcome. The second one is a real prevailing lack of ambition in the CBD targets. This kind of current draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is currently out for review. It's moved on a bit since the previous iteration, but there's still a lot of criticism from civil society organisations that it's really just not ambitious enough. And I don't know whether FFI is involved in this, but a number of civil society organisations are really pushing for the idea of a global goal for biodiversity that is equivalent to the net zero goal that we have under the Climate Change Convention. And so thinking about what would a nature positive goal look like for biodiversity, and how can we get enough political momentum going to really push the CBD for that goal. And then a final challenge is this need for the UK to act both at home and abroad. And I think it will be challenging, you know, with the dramatic impacts that COVID has had on our economies and on our sort of developing country partner economies, to push for a recovery plan that is green and slow, rather than just deregulating and going for the most rapid recovery plan possible in order to kind of regain some of those economic losses. So I think, you know, we don't want to build back better, we want to build forward better, and we want that forward building to be greener and slower and more resilient. But I think, again, there'll be a lot of political pressure for it to happen as quickly as possible, and potentially, you know, at a cost to nature. In terms of sort of thinking about the role of FFI and my organisation and others, I really think that civil society organisations have a vital role to play. And I know from talking to our UK government partners, civil servants, that they really see that role as being incredibly important as well. So I think there's a real role in terms of sort of helping to build narratives around sustainability, around nature positive, and kind of engendering a sense of inevitability that there is going to be a day of reckoning about, for example, the sustainability of commodity supply chains, and bringing along other countries where we have partners to that sort of common narrative and more positive narrative. I think we can wield influence on all parties as they go into these negotiations through our networks of partners. And I think FFI is particularly well placed to do that because you have partnerships all around the world and work with local organisations. We can provide really excellent case studies through ourselves and through our partners of nature-based solutions and other nature-positive actions actually happening on the ground to give policymakers a clear idea of what this might look like in practice. And I think bringing together both environment and development organisations, and my organisation sort of sits at that interface between environment and development, I think bringing together sort of cross-sectoral coalitions really does help demonstrate a common purpose in the UK and increases the pressure to deliver on UK government, so they haven't got conservation and development organisations arguing with each other as they did over the initial sort of nature fund discussions, but really coming together where they know jointly what they want and they're pushing the UK government to achieve that. And I think we're making steps towards that through the People and Nature campaign, which does bring together conservation and development organisations, through BOND, which is an organisation, a sort of a network of British NGOs, which has a development and environment group. But I think more is potentially needed, and the more we can keep piling on this pressure to UK government, building coalitions of like-minded organisations which all want to see the same outcomes, the more the better. And I think it would be much appreciated by our civil service friends. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Dilys, thank you very much indeed. That was a great overview of what the UK is trying to do, but equally a very clear message to the pressure that they need and that all governments need from NGOs, from civil society organisations to actually push everybody in the right direction, because we've got some big challenges politically, economically, and indeed geopolitically, as you said. Let's move on to Jo Elliott's presentation. Jo is our Senior Director of Conservation Partnerships, and so she's here ideally placed to talk to us now about what FFI does in all the work that we do with companies and governments. So it leads on beautifully from Dilys. Thank you for setting it up with that slide on the need for pressure from CSOs. Jo, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to just spend a few minutes adding some FFI reflections to this process. As both of our wonderful panel to date have emphasised, this pandemic has been stark in its impact. In terms of shining a spotlight on the linkages between nature and human well-being, it has made us all stop and think and to start asking ourselves pretty big questions. So I've just put 3 down here. How does the pandemic change things? What more do we need to do? What do we need to do differently? At FFI, for the last 5 months, we've spent much of this period just coping with the pandemic and helping our partners cope. As those of you who were listening to the first webinar will have heard, our partners have really had a tough time and continue to have a tough time. But also we've been pausing to reflect ourselves and to consult widely across these questions. And I think 2 of the places where we know, we obviously don't have answers to all these questions yet, but 2 of the places where we know we need to do things differently and faster are, firstly, accelerating the way in which we are addressing the linkages between nature and climate, and of course human well-being. And secondly, to really look at government and corporate ambitions and to help hold them to account. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes exploring those 2 questions. Firstly, looking into FFI's work on climate to date, we've long known that much of our ongoing work is contributing to climate change mitigation, though we don't actually measure it as such, from working with our Scottish marine community partners to get kelp dredging banned in Scotland, through to the work of the Global Trees campaign, which seeks to conserve endangered trees in situ globally. But in terms of adaptation, specifically, while most of our global program is focused on building the resilience of ecosystems, our explicit work on adaptation has largely been through working on conservation agriculture across multiple projects with farmers to trial and demonstrate adaptive agriculture practices. And in fact, the weight of our work on climate to date has really been in this long established program of projects on REDD+, so reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, with the pro-nature and human impact safeguards established. And we've been doing that across Central America, Africa, parts of Southeast Asia. And our real learning, the successes of these sort of large and small scale REDD projects to date have really been in terms of the impact we've been able to deliver on forest management practices, on securing rights for communities to deliver forest management, rather than on generating and transferring large volumes of carbon dollars to date. And this is all fairly significant. In part, it reflects the rather disappointing scale and value of, particularly of compliance markets for carbon to date. But I think it also has allowed, it's been part of the world's reflection as this large program of REDD projects has been developed, that actually the cost of supplying really differentiated pro-nature carbon into markets has been significantly underestimated. You know, this is really the costs of conservation, which means combating all those threats to conservation. And there's a lot to learn from all of this, particularly as we enter this period that I think Dilys in particular was highlighting, of moving towards finding the mechanisms that will deliver Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We are seeing, and we have been seeing, a huge expansion of the a perceived expansion of the potential for offset and voluntary markets, for compliance and voluntary markets going forwards. And you will have all noted a flurry of large corporate commitments to net zero over the last few months, which is really responding both to this potential perceived market going forwards, but also to the pressure on companies from ESG requirements, from their financiers, from their shareholders, and increasingly from their supply chains, from their customers, and from staff, and from their leadership teams. And we believe there's an awful lot to be pulled up from these programs of REDD projects into the thinking about how these markets should be shaped going forwards, particularly in terms of the methodologies that have been established, the governance frameworks that have been tried and tested and often failed, the ways in which communities have been engaged and have been made the engineers and the drivers of benefit flows in different forms. And that's something FFI is very much part of, is trying to bring that learning to this process. To the extent that we've been involved in global policy framing around climate, as Tony was highlighting, this really has been, for us, it's been a sea change over the last 2 years. So it was only 18 months ago that we went to Davos for the first time, actually on a platform of how to bring biodiversity to the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals, where in fact we ended up speaking primarily about the linkages between biodiversity and climate change, the non-linearity of those relationships, and the fact that there's an awful lot of gaps in the science in terms of what we actually know about tipping points, interlinkages, the role of the ocean in climate circling, in carbon circling, and so on. And most recently, we were invited onto the steering committee for the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance, which is the World Economic Forum and World Business Council on Sustainable Development's joint initiative with a bunch of leading corporates to try and bring some practical corporate-led ambition into COP26 targets for next year. So if I just build on that, essentially just to highlight now what we think we need from governments and then corporates and FFI's response. So from governments, I won't labour this one because I'm simply echoing what Tony and Dilys have said. We need governments that lead this transition, that create coherent national policy frameworks, particularly that hold corporates to account for their global footprints and their global supply chains. And we need investment in truly green recoveries. And the one I note was the publication of the report last week from the high-level panel on oceans, which highlighted the potential for ocean-based renewable energy systems to create millions of jobs over the next few years, for example. So, you know, the scope for rethinking economics here is pretty darn substantial, and for being brave and taking those risks as we move forward. With specific reference to UK government, FFI has done a lot of work with UK government quietly over the years, not just in the Scottish Marine sense, but for example, the ban on microbeads that we rolled out to other countries, and a lot of consultation with DEFRA around the international agenda. And we echo what Dilys and Tony have been talking about in terms of the unique opportunity over the next 18 months to show leadership, but particularly to show, for the UK to establish credibility as a leader, we really need that coherent domestic policy framework. And we need the UK to stand up and be willing to acknowledge the need to reverse its status as one of the world's most nature depleted countries. So to get behind the work of Natural England and all the other domestic stakeholders in really delivering visible impact on the ground and locking that into this leadership role that we all hope that the UK will help take. Next slide, please. So in terms of corporates, you will mostly be aware that FFI has a pretty long and robust history of partnering large corporates and helping to enabling them, but also holding them to account for their environmental practices on the ground in high biodiversity value landscapes, and in shaping the guidelines and frameworks for their sort of industry and association level practices around that. So as these net zero commitments from corporates are turned into, we hope, transparent, clear, measurable, and milestone-laden pathways to zero emissions, we want to be part of the process of making sure those pathways are pro-nature, and, you know, being the friend in the room with the corporates, helping hold them to their own targets. And we have great hopes for 2021 really being a year of reset. So we have hopes that, for example, this Natural Climate Solutions Alliance partnership that we're helping and that we're part of, we rather hope that they will come to Glasgow next year with a evidence demand for gigatons of green carbon, green and blue carbon. So we're setting that challenge. Let's see if the system can rise to that challenge. And the final slide, please, Laura. So what does FFI need to do to rise to the challenge? Well, that's a question we're still in the process of answering. But what we do know is our climate change ambitions are clear and are more important than ever. So we really need to build the resilience of our global program, working with partners on the ground to ensure that the program is resilient to climate change across all our habitat and species targets, but also that we are optimizing the role that our target areas play in carbon storage and carbon sequestration. And we will be investing in these areas over the next period of time. we want to help ensure that the climate finance system that is well underway in terms of ambition and development, that it is pro-nature, and that it brings finance to the places, but also to the people that need to be supported in the change that's required. We very much come in behind IIED's bring finance to where the finance is needed, rather than leaving it in the global system approach to this. And then in terms of footprint, as all of you, I'm sure, are equally experiencing, you know, the critical lessons of the last 5 months for us as an organisation, in terms of reducing our travel, in terms of really responding to the opportunity for effective remote working and remote collaboration, and building these very democratic global collaboration and conversation opportunities. We aim to do more of that, and to keep our footprint as low as possible, and to encourage our partners to do the same. So in short, my summary is that we are aware that the trajectory of nature loss continues downwards, despite the optimism of Tony's framing of what we could do if we got it all right. For the moment, it isn't right, and we need to change the systems and the decision-making processes to bring all of that into better alignment. We do need UK government to take up the high-level diplomacy that is required over the next 18 months to really deliver on the potential that this could deliver in terms of this policy framework that will work. And as an organisation, we aim to deliver the partnerships, the collaborations, and the on-the-ground action that will hopefully make a significant contribution to reversing that trajectory. Thank you.
Jo, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. We've got some great questions here. And in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to group them a bit. We've got some questions about politics. We've got some questions about actions needed from individuals and corporates. And we've got some questions about FFI. Let's start with the politics, because I think that's a key area. And there are three I'm going to pull together. One is a pessimistic thought about human nature and the prospects of political institutions thinking beyond the election cycle. What can we do to encourage long-term thinking, which is very overdue? And with that, a specifically UK-related question: is Boris Johnson the right man to lead this? And from Chris Waddell, loaded just now, do you think that the current government will keep to its promises and be more environmentally friendly than it would have been had we stayed in the EU? So some good loaded questions there. Who would like to kick off? Tony, do you want to have first crack at that?
So you have to remind me, Andrew, if I've forgotten the full suite of questions, but just some brief thoughts on some of those subjects. So this long-term, short-term thing, our political cycles are 4 to 5 years. These environmental challenges, depending on how you look at them, you know, they're centuries long. And so there is a chasm between the two. So one thing that I was involved with some years ago was the campaign for the Climate Change Act. And the very reason for that was the answer to that question of creating a framework that spanned multiple administrations. And we made the argument largely on that basis to say climate change is a long-term issue. Politics is by definition short-term. We need something to bridge between the two. And so we won that argument. And now we have the Environment Bill going through Parliament, and there is some comparable structure coming there in terms of targets for biodiversity recovery, for example. So that's one answer to that, is to be making the case for frameworks that go beyond one government. And you know, that is something which is rational and logical, and we can win the argument on that. In terms of the individual personalities, you know, I think our current Prime Minister is passionate about this stuff, and he does get it. And he has people with him in the cabinet who also get it. And I think, you know, the mood has changed literally over the last couple of years, actually. It is remarkable how quickly things have shifted. And the combination of public willingness and political leadership, including with the backing of at least some enlightened corporations now, it is an unusual situation. We've not had it before. And actually touching on one or two of the points that Dilys and Joe touched on, the other thing which is new is that we now have a very high level of interest amongst financial institutions. And this actually is also potentially a very big deal in terms of how the transition now begins to accelerate. So hopefully what we're at the beginning of is you know, a curve of accelerated action. What we can't have any longer is the incrementalism of the last decades, because it's failed. You know, the nature's been going down, the greenhouse gas concentrations have been going up, and we need a reset of the entire system now, and it's going to require politics to be in the driving seat.
Dilys, what do you feel about our politicians and their ability to think long term, and particularly the incumbents?
Oh, I have to be careful what I say here. I agree with Tony. I actually do think that Boris is enthusiastic about these issues, and I think he largely gets them. I think there have been some, you know, I think, as I say, with the purpose of our campaign has been sort of constantly pulling back in the people side of investing in nature and not just getting excited about black rhinos and Sumatran tigers. I think appointing Zach Goldsmith as a joint minister across DEFRA and DFID was actually a really inspired move, whosever decision that was, you know, actually bringing together environment and development under one minister. I guess what worries me in terms of the UK showing leadership, and I have to say some of my colleagues at IIED kind of guffawed at the thought of this, you know, with our sort of move to unilateralism as to whether we can then set ourselves forward to be the new global leaders on nature and climate, is something to be considered. But I think, you know, I think the enthusiasm and the characters, if we are going to do this in the UK, we probably do have the right people at the moment that are championing it. Thank
you. I'm going to move on from the political subject to fire one at Joe, not to let you off the hook on politicians, but to move on to a different one, Joe, which two questions. One from Barnaby Briggs here, which is specifically for you. Will leadership from the corporates come from the old established businesses or new ones with different business models? And along with that, what can the public do to help advance the agenda, and what pressure do we all as individuals need to apply?
Ooh, good questions. So I think just answering the first one, the easy answer is both. So, you know, I'm fascinated. In FFI, we have two big projects going on with the World Economic Forum. One is the one I described, and the other is it's called Vision 2030, which is with all the big technology companies. Now, the interesting thing is their carbon footprint is just of a different magnitude and order. I mean, obviously, if we do their full supply chain analysis, they've got as hefty a carbon footprint as many. But compared to the big extractive sectors, which are the ones involved in the other initiative that I did talk about, there's nothing by comparison. So frankly, we need the leadership from the people who are causing the most pollution. And are they in the best place to lead? They're struggling. It is, as you'll have seen, anyone reading the financial and economic press at the moment will see that there's an awful lot of debate in there about what these transition pathways are going to look like and what the implications are and how we might measure it. And, you know, when I read ambitions like our ambition is to get the intensity of our oil production down from 26 kilograms to 24 kilograms in the next 8 years, I go, seriously? That really is not much of an ambition, you know, and that's only the production end. So there's a lot of work to do on that. But do we think there's leadership? Absolutely. Listen to the CEOs of those big companies now. This is completely up there on their agenda. And I would add to what, I'm not sure who just said about the finance sector, I think it was Tony, but those pension funds are what's pulling out the long term. So the big European state pension funds are massive players in pushing us out to long-term thinking, which is wonderful. But to answer the second question, oh my goodness, this is exactly what we need to be. We need, and I don't know how we do it. I'm very intrigued to see what ideas we come up with over the next few months, but we need movements to start better holding governments to account in every, governments and companies in every country we work in. You know, in some places there's huge civil society voice and effectiveness and so on. In other places, you know, for various reasons, there's less hold. So I think us working with our partner organisations to understand that better and to figure out what we can do about it, and to get, you know, just our general voice and profile. This is part of FFI's ambition of raising our voice and profile, is to be able to influence not just UK stakeholders, but stakeholders across our global programme, and help enable people to feel they've got a voice to hold people to account.
Yeah.
Tony, you've campaigned, you've been a campaigner, you've worked with government, you've worked with all sorts of organisations. In answer to that, you know, what should we all do? What would your answer be?
So as individuals, I think there are three things that matter. So thing number one is to start behaving as though it's important to you as an individual, and, you know, recycling, sustainable energy in your house, walking, electric vehicles, you know, all the things that we know about, they kind of rub off on our fellow citizens. And the more people see this stuff as being mainstream and something their friends and family do, the more it starts to get into the culture. And in the end, culture is what drives politics and the economy, because how we consume and how we live, in the end, it shapes what the politicians think is permissible and desirable, and it shapes how companies invest in what the future of their business is going to be. And on those two, you know, we have to be very active in both of those spheres as well. So taking personal actions in our daily lives, and then reflecting that in what we say to our elected representatives and what we say to candidates before elections, and how we would like them to prioritise all the things we've talked about today. And then the dialogue we have with supermarkets and energy providers and vehicle manufacturers, and telling them what we do want and what we don't want. And, you know, I'm always surprised by the rapidity of replies I get on Twitter when I go into a shop and complain about something. Their communications people are right on it, and they're logging it, and they know. And the more of us that do that, the more it becomes very obvious what the future of businesses and politics looks like. And, you know, so it's just all about us just using our voice in so many ways, our wallet and our voice and our behaviour, and how that rubs off on everyone. And it does work. I mean, the reason we're where we are today compared to where we were 10 years ago is because of all of that. It's people behaving differently, telling the politicians something new, and requiring the companies to change. And you know, the quicker it goes, the better. And the more of us that do it, the quicker it will go. And there's quite simple mathematics behind that, I think, in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm conscious that we've gone past the hour, but I'm not going to let you three of you go without one last combined question. And it's this one. If you had to pick one change, what is the one most important, most fundamental thing that you would focus on? Everything's interrelated, but is there one thing that you would prioritize? I'm going to start with Dilys, then Tony, and then Jo. And in Jo's case, I want her to talk about what that one thing should be from an FFI point of view. Your top priority. Okay. Dilys. Totally unfair question.
Yeah, thanks for making me go first. I'll remember. Top priority. I think this is a absolutely unique opportunity for us to, you know, do what it sounds like a bit of a catchphrase, reset our relationship with nature. But I think the one thing that this pandemic has demonstrated to me is that if the government wants to do things, extraordinarily unusual things, it can do them, and it will do them. And I think it shows, therefore, that we can do things like stopping fossil fuel subsidies, stopping agricultural intensification subsidies, repurposing the finance that goes into perverse subsidies into things that are good for biodiversity, good for people, and good for climate change. And I think that is the most important thing, to seize this moment and actually use it for transformative change, and not to take the arguments that we can't do that because, you know, it would be too expensive or it's not politically expedient, because I think this pandemic has shown us that we can do things, and government will do quite extreme things if they think that they absolutely have to.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well said. Tony?
In a similar vein to Dilys, I would say my top priority would be to replace growth in GDP as our headline economic indicator with a new indicator that would be growth in human well-being and growth in ecological efficiency, and combining those two into a new headline indicator, because that would change everything. It would drive a circular economy, it would shift investment patterns, it would change public spending priorities, it would make sure that those subsidies that Dilys mentioned were ended because they'd be pointing in the wrong direction. And every now and again you get little glimpses of how this might be possible. The Treasury obviously at the moment has this review from Sir Partha Dasgupta under review, looking at the value of biodiversity for the economy. And so hopefully we can use that as a bit of a springboard to advance some of those kinds of arguments.
Wonderful. As somebody once said, what gets measured gets managed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Joe, you get the closing word, and with a stress on what the top pick is from FFI's point of view and how FFI is positioning itself in all of this.
Okay, I am going to say two quick things. So one is that we keep doing what we do, and what we do really, really well is delivering these really impactful programs of work on the ground, and we mainstream climate into that. But so I think that's the most important thing that we do. But I do think there is something incredibly important over the next period of time for bringing biodiversity back into the climate discussions and the climate process. So the risk is that all of this goes ahead to the end of next year, massive carbon markets and so on, and we end up with a whole load of trillion trees type campaigns where everyone's out planting trees and people have forgotten about the old growth forests and the ocean. So I want old growth forests and ocean to be at the heart of the thinking for the next year.
Okay.
Thank you. Dilys, Joe, Tony, thank you all very much indeed. I think that's been not only really good reminder of the issues, but an inspiring and positive vision of what could happen, and indeed what potentially the UK can do, and some very friendly remarks about our leader, which I think were very generous, which is wonderful. Thank you all for participating, for joining us in this webinar. Delighted to see so many people. We have recorded this. It will be loaded onto the website. If there are questions that we didn't manage to answer, or there are follow-up questions that anybody has, please do send them to Laura, who sent you the invitation to the webinar, and we'll come back to you. This is an incredibly important topic. It's at the core of everything ultimately that everyone here on the screen cares about and is doing. So we want to continue the discussion, and we look forward to more discussions like this, and hopefully one day not just discussions like this, but who knows, even in a room, able to shake each other's hands.
It's coming.
All the best to all of you, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Joe. Thanks, Dilys. See you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
bye.
Tony.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.